Добрий день, я вітаю всіх.
Hello everyone, my name is Olga Tamanova. This is Media Center Ukraine, Ukrinform, 10 years of the war. And today we have invited you to discuss a very important topic indeed, the crimes committed in Crimea, the evidence that Ukraine handed over to the International Criminal Court, especially crimes against humanity committed in Crimea. Since 2014, as we learned, the main goal of the Russian occupation authorities in Crimea is to erase any religious identity of our people there. Everything that goes against their so-called vision, religious vision, something that doesn't fall under the rule of the Russian patriarchy. Namely, we're talking about the members of the Orthodox Church, witnesses and Muslims. Well, let's discuss today what evidence Ukraine has passed to the ICC. So our today's participants are Ihor Ponochevny, head of the Prosecutor's Office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Also today with us is Jordash, managing partner of Global Rights Compliance. Today with us is Tamila, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and Andriy, Shchekun, representative of the Crimean Diocese of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So hello everyone, and let's start with this new information that we have handed over, all the new evidence that we handed over to the ICC. So Ihor, let's start with you. Afternoon, colleagues. Pleasure seeing you here today. It's true that while walking here today, we received the confirmation that the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC has received our 14th submission on the crimes committed by the occupation authorities against the religious groups in Crimea. In all 10 years of occupation of Russian Crimea, the island of lack of freedom now exists there with the rule of Russian criminal laws. During 10 years, the civilians experience only lack of abidance to the law and impunity from the occupation authorities. Just think about it. About 117 persons have been sentenced in Crimea under fake charges, and the sentence is 4 to 19 years of imprisonment. Totally 1,230 years of imprisonment. That's the total duration for all the political prisoners sentenced in Crimea for political, religious, national, ethnical reasons. As you probably know, since 2017, the Prosecution Office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea works closely with NGOs, with international experts who helped the law enforcement agencies of the Autonomous Republic, the Prosecutor's Office, police, and the SBU to document the crimes against humanity committed in Crimea and to use this evidence at the international level, namely to prepare and file to the Office of Prosecutor of the ICC of relevant submissions, case referrals. So the first international experts who helped the Prosecution Office of the Autonomous Republic were Jordash and his team from Global Rights Compliance, who have not only prepared the first submission, but who from the very beginning started training our prosecutors on the basics of international humanitarian law, help them to understand what actions of the invaders, of the occupiers, could be qualified as war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. Because in essence, not a single law enforcement agency in Ukraine until 2017 would be systematically involved in investigating either war crimes or crimes against humanity. So there was no focus on the crimes that the Russian Federation has already committed at Donbas region. So these are criminal charges, terrorism, murders on top of the previous crimes. So global rights compliance people were the first who extended the helpful hand and who started systematically working with the Prosecutor's Office of Crimea. Today we present to you the results of our joint efforts, submission to the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC, crimes committed against the religious groups in Crimea. This is the 14th such submission to the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC, and it contains evidence that were collected by the law enforcement agencies of the Autonomous Republic, together with the NGOs, evidence collected as part of the investigation of national criminal proceedings. So we use our criminal proceedings for two jurisdictions, for national and for international ones. Currently in those criminal proceedings we documented more than 90 facts of attacks and persecutions against the representatives of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Jehovah's Witnesses, Protestants, Muslims, and all the other religious minorities. So we can see that Russia in Crimea tries to introduce the monopoly of the Moscow Orthodox Church, which, as you know, plays one of the key roles in keeping the civilians in Crimea under terror and submission, and in the Russian Federation at large, being submissive to the current authorities, and is being used as quite an efficient propaganda tool mechanism so that they could erase in Crimea any and all Ukrainian identities.
Простіше, наприклад, асимілювати.
It's much easier to assimilate Russians with Ukrainians or Ukrainians with the Russians, but the Russian authorities don't stop with that. They even create pseudo-religious organizations, including Muslim ones, so that even Crimean Tatar population would be assimilated under the Russian Orthodox world, so that they would be operating with the same narratives. As to the Orthodox Church of Crimea, the Crimean Diocese, unfortunately, its activities in Crimea have been discontinued because each religious community was under persecution. The services were not allowed, churches closed, property taken. Andriy Shchekun will tell more about this. On Crimean Muslims, on the other hand, the law enforcement agencies of the occupying authorities play by their playbook. Starting from 2016-17, everything plays out the same scenario. They're carrying out a search, finding the literature forbidden in Russia, then apprehension, tortures, violation of the right to fair trial, if this could be labeled as trial in the Russian Federation, and ultimately it would end up with imprisonment in the Russian prisons for quite long terms. The same is true for Jehovah's Witnesses and Crimean Muslims. They're being apprehended and deprived of liberty for substantial periods of time. This has been documented, and we are documenting in our criminal cases. This all has been followed up with tortures, absence of medical assistance during the pre-trial remand phase, and thus we can conclude that Russia, using religion, has introduced to the maximum extent possible the monopoly of its Orthodox Church at the Crimean Peninsula, erasing any remembrance about Ukraine, about Ukrainian religions, about Crimean Tatar religion, to colonize the peninsula not only with bringing in its population, but also its religion. Now, keeping the timing in mind, as for the ICC's involvement, as you know, on the 2nd of March 2022, the Office of Prosecutor of the ICC has announced that there will be the initiation of the investigations about the situation in Ukraine, namely the case that has been launched since 2014, covering the events on Maidan in Crimea and in the east of Ukraine. All the evidence that we submitted in our previous 13 information submissions were attached, but now the priorities after the full-fledged invasion have shifted for obvious reasons. Now the focus of attention of the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC is to the events at the mainland Ukraine, and investigations are mostly conducted according to those facts. But our today's submission is to help the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC to have enough evidence at hand about the crimes committed by the occupiers both in Crimea, and I hope that it would help the office to prosecute and sentence ultimately the top political and military leaders of the Russian Federation. Of course, the Ukrainian judicial system carries its own burden of trying to prosecute the Russian war criminals, but still the crimes under discussion, that's the jurisdiction of the ICC. So our submission is to inform the Prosecutor's Office that the war crimes and crimes against humanity are being perpetrated in Crimea, including the religious traits. Thank you. Thank you, Igor. Now, brief clarification. You say that the domestic laws and case law cover the same crimes, and well, we have 93 facts of attacks and persecutions of religious groups in Crimea thus far. I don't want to tell you the exact number of the criminal cases open because it doesn't coincide with the number of evidence. There might be one case with 10 facts if it covers the same religious group. But all in all, that's 93 crimes that we have documented so far. Thank you. Mr. Wayne, let's look at those crimes from the standpoint of international law. So what does it tell us?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to the Crimean prosecutor. And we are very privileged to have taken part in drafting this submission. Now, at the heart of the submission is a ruthless religious persecution in the occupied Crimean Peninsula, excuse me, which has been going on for now 10 years. Evidence gathered by the Crimean prosecutors is clear, convincing. It is of a systematic campaign by the Russian Federation aimed at erasing religious identity, any religious identity that is not Kremlin compliant, any identity which in any way is perceived as opposing Russia's occupation of the peninsula, any identity which is alleged to be in opposition to Russia's policy of Russification. And it's important, I think, that we begin the story in Crimea, because Crimea is critical for many reasons. I won't reiterate all of them, but it obviously has symbolic value, it has religious value. Prior to Russia's occupation of the peninsula, Crimea represented a multicultural, multi-ethnic region that was a symbol of peaceful coexistence of various groups and communities representative of the diverse Ukrainian nation. Ethnic Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Of course, Crimea also holds historical and national symbolism, and we've seen that in the last couple of weeks with the commemoration of the Revolution of Dignity and the subsequent start of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's partly why Crimea remains important. It is the start of Russia's illegal invasion. But most importantly, I would say, the occupation of Crimea and the persecution of religious groups and the persecution of those who oppose Russia's illegal conduct began in Crimea, and in a sense, the occupation of Crimea is the beginning of the essence of Russia's overall criminal plan, the overall criminal plan to subjugate the Ukrainian population and destroy Ukrainian identity. The crimes we're seeing today in Ukraine did not just occur. They didn't occur in a vacuum. They occurred as a consequence of the invasion of Crimea, which was a staging ground for the full-scale invasion, a test run, if you like, for Russia's crimes that would be scaled up in February of 2022. And it has to be said, the international community did not do enough. It has not done enough in relation to Crimea. From weak statements by the UN General Assembly to weak sanctions. And the International Criminal Court is not without fault here. For 8 years, Ukraine has been waiting for a response from the ICC in relation to Crimea. We hope that will change, and we hope this submission, which is part of a series of submissions filed by the Crimean Prosecutor, will change that response. The crimes contained within this submission are, as I've said, clear. Russia has systematically targeted members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Kiev Patriarch, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Crimean Muslims, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and other minorities such as the Roman Catholics, Jews, Greek Catholics, and Protestants. Russian authorities have outlawed particular religious groups, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, stripped religious groups of their places of worship, denied the residency of members of religious groups, imposed heavy fines and lengthy sentences. But more than that, read the submission and you will see the detention of religious members, the torture of religious groups. It is hard reading this submission because the crimes are so serious and so horrific. As I've said, this submission complements information provided in 12 previous communications made by the Crimean Prosecutor's Office concerning the situation in Crimea since 2014, including the 2022 communication on the persecution of Crimean Tatars on the basis of ethnic and/or political grounds. In short, based on the evidence collected by the Crimean Prosecutor's Office, investigators of the Security Service of Ukraine and the National Police of Ukraine, as well as open source information, this submission provides compelling evidence the commission of 9 war crimes and 7 crimes against humanity, including acts of killing, torture, unlawful detention, deportation or forcible transfer, and persecution, as well as rape and other forms of sexual violence. These are as serious crimes as you will find. Crimea and the fate of its population subjected to Russian crimes must no longer be swept under the carpet. That is why we are where we are now, with Russian authorities believing they have impunity. We must, the ICC must, take notice of this submission. Thank you.
Дякую, Вейне. Пані Таміло.
Thank you, Wayne. Ms. Tamila, we discussed some legal aspects. Well, now let's talk about this religious nature of persecution of the Ukrainian citizens, residents there in Crimea. You keep your hands on the pulse of the current situation and the situation that was evolving over the course of the past 10 years. So back to you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And first of all, for all the work done by the Prosecution Office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. The 14th submission to the ICC is very important, even though it's not the direct aspect under the jurisdiction of my office, because we're mostly monitoring and overseeing the performance of our domestic law enforcement agencies, but unfortunately there are still new apprehensions in Crimea, new searches in Crimea. I am very much afraid that today's searches, as a result, could lead to some new additional apprehensions, including the members of Crimean Muslims, so which will increase, unfortunately, the number of political prisoners. The occupying authorities, the Crimean Peninsula, like was mentioned previously by my colleagues, trying to erase the identity of ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic residents of the Crimean Peninsula. And it does it so using various religious, controlled by the occupying authorities, religious groups like Russian Orthodox Church and, unfortunately, the spiritual leadership of some of the Tatar Muslim organizations. And back in 2014 and part of 2015, the spiritual leaders of Muslim community of the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol try not to collaborate that much with the invaders, but then through the oppression, Mufti Miriablai has turned his code completely, and unfortunately we see a number of crimes perpetrated or committed by these spiritual leaders. Anything that is not under the control of so-called federal authorities under the Kremlin, all this at the territory of the peninsula, banned or persecuted. So initially, the federal authorities used formal grounds, making all the religious organizations to re-register. So January 2014, before occupation started, there were 220 religious organizations, of whom 1546 were re-registered according to the then current Russian legislation. As of January 2024, 10 years later, even this number has dwindled, so now it's 931 religious organizations. So this reduction, obviously, happened first and foremost by other aspects of the Russian federal legislation, which is completely alien. It's more repressive. It's the one that takes religious organizations' life under control, disallowing certain ones to re-register, and it's constant pressure and coercion of religious leaders. What's worth mentioning in terms of persecution of Muslims, and both previous speakers touched that topic already, but what we observe, again speaking in figures, Ihor mentioned the persecutions of Crimean Tatars, but we are aware that as of January 2024, at least 100 cases of persecutions of Crimean Tatars on religious grounds. By the way, 208 Crimean cases, of them 125 are Crimean Tatars, so most of the persecutions being carried out clearly on religious and ethnic grounds. Another thing to state here that unfortunately, those Sevastopol religious leaders are being used for propaganda reasons, especially after the beginning of the full-fledged invasion. Emir Eli Ablaev, this mufti that operates at the occupied peninsula, as of January 2023, he stated that all the muftis that are not yet under control are 10 mosques only. And he stated that he would involve federal law enforcement agencies trying to resolve this issue, basically coercing those 10 remaining mosques across Crimea, trying to put them out of business, claim as Deputy Mufti stated. So this spiritual leadership are asking Crimean Tatars to trust only trusted information statements of the federal authorities, of Mufti from Sevastopol and his deputies, also address all issues only with that spiritual leadership department, again claiming that any other movements not controlled from the Kremlin, any structures not controlled by the Kremlin would only lie. That's why you can trust only one source of information. The searches in mosques continue, body searches of Muslims, then searches at houses, allegedly finding forbidden literature, thus starting cases about those Muslims. So as of February 24, Russian media stated that Kherson and Kharkiv Muslims also want to be under jurisdiction of the Sevastopol spiritual leaders, and the practices that we observe at the newly occupied territories, both Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, they are carbon copy, the same playbook used to go after and erase identity at the newly occupied territories. Andriy Shchekun, I believe, would tell us more about the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but it's quite clear that one of the communities that is being actively persecuted from the very beginning was the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. At that time, it was still the Kiev Patriarchy. Then, when we received Thomas, then it was Orthodox Church of Ukraine already. And by the way, Metropolitan Clement initially claimed that the church would not re-register itself, and thus, since not being re-registered at the occupied territory, according to the federal legislation, they're not allowed to carry out their religious activities. And unfortunately, according to Metropolitan Clement, after full-fledged invasion, the performance of Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been discontinued in Crimea because the priests, after coercing them by trying to mobilize the priests when they had to change their place of residence, not to be mobilized, so that then the metropolits stated at the official press conference that unfortunately the Orthodox Church of Ukraine discontinued its performance at the territory of the peninsula. Of course, the property of that church has become the target of greedy local authorities. Andriy will tell most about us, but also the effect of persecution of the Jehovah's Witnesses and another international organization as New Generation. What's important? On Jehovah's Witnesses, there was the ruling 2017, the ruling at the territory of the Russian Federation, which became valid at the territories that that country controls, namely the Crimean Peninsula, and lots of members of the Jehovah's Witnesses movement were persecuted in Crimea. The same is true in case of the New Generation. So, summing up, anything that is not under their control, they persecute. And of course, they persecute based on ethnical and religious grounds, and the lawyers will tell you more accurately, but it might have the traits of some genocidal practices, and of course, crimes against humanity at the territory of the whole of Ukraine, but it all started at the Crimean Peninsula, and then in Donetsk and Luhansk region, and only after we liberate absolutely all of our territories and after the victory in this war, we could stop the persecutions that we currently witness at all of the territory, including at the temporarily occupied territory of the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you, Tamila. Now, Andriy, let's talk about the persecution of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Thank you. Metropolite Clement, who leads Simferopol Diocese, passes his best greetings, and we are grateful to the Prosecutor's Office and the representatives of the President for close cooperation during all 10 years of occupation. He is also grateful to all the people who were on his team all these 10 years and were documenting the crimes when he couldn't leave the occupied territory. And I am a member of that team, which since 1996 started forming the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, at that time of Kiev Patriarchy. So I went all that way together with Metropolite Clement, and we did everything possible to preserve this religious community in Crimea, because that was a peaceful opposition there. When people, Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, will come to the churches, will pray in Ukrainian language, praying for the armed forces of Ukraine. Yeah, you might not believe it, but that was happening all through the years of the occupation. And on March the 11th, 2014, it's the Archerian Church of Kiev Patriarch at that time, in its official statement, blamed Russians for occupation and blessed the armed forces of Ukraine to fight for territorial integrity of the country. Thus, the leaders of the Crimean Orthodox Church presented its position to the Russian authorities as occupiers. The same statements referred to the evidence of crimes committed against churchgoers, abduction of some people, including myself, a person, and Anatoly Kovalsky, another churchgoer. We were both abducted at that time. Crimean Diocese in Crimea plays the special role among the Christian communities in Ukraine. It's the second largest Crimean community in Crimea. The churchgoers are mostly ethnic Ukrainians who are mostly discriminated. You probably know that this year's ruling about the discrimination of ethnic Ukrainians because of vanishing of all Ukrainian language education. So back in 2014, village of Perevalne, 2022, and at that time we were in front of the monument of Shchekun, the first event that we carried out after the events of late February, the occupation. Again, green soldiers that is to say Russians, as we learned from the informants, will seize the church. So we, the activists, came to protect the church, which we did, but after so-called referendum on June the 1st, 2014, this church has been transferred to the property of the Moscow Patriarch, which was the fate of all of our churches seized by that patriarchy in Crimea and in Sevastopol city. Father Makary in the city of Sevastopol, when they seized his church, was carrying out services at home, but Yarovaya law that came into force in Crimea banned such services from being conducted at home. So FSB came to Father Makary and warned him that if he wouldn't stop, then they would arrest him and prosecute him. That's why he stopped doing that. In 2015, so-called the Ministry of Property addressed Metropolitan of Ukrainian Orthodox Church to learn what to do with Cathedral Church in the city of Simferopol, trying to change treaty terms and conditions signed before the occupation, trying to increase the rent, etc. So that's when Clement said no dialogue with the occupiers. So since 2015, they launched so-called court hearings against our church, using the laws of the Russian Federation against us. In 2017, some of the churches, on so-called legal grounds of the so-called Russian Federation, were alienated from us, and part of this cathedral was also occupied in 2017. And when the Metropolitan tried to protect his premises, he was arm wrestled out. He addressed so-called police and medical authorities, healthcare institutions, but that's when they occupied part of the cathedral. Now, 2019, the occupying authorities of Crimea continued the seizure of the whole cathedral now as a result of court hearings in 2019, and I include rulings of the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of the aggressor country. And last year, 2023, the Russian court-martial service has sealed the cathedral. So May the 11th, 2023, is when the cathedral discontinued its services because we had no access to the premises. What happened with the property? Well, all through those years, we have no clue what Russians did to our property, but what we know is that they again are ready to transfer the title for this cathedral to the Moscow Patriarchy, like for so many other churches transferred before. So, another example, another case in Yevpatoria, when the Russian authorities ruled that the churchgoers have to demolish their own church themselves. Of course, this ruling has not been carried out by a single person, and that's why all of them are being constantly penalized monthly. And this fine amount accrues interest on it. And we suspect that soon enough the so-called Russian authorities would instigate cases against those who refuse to perform the ruling on demolishing their own church. Another case, the church in the village of Balki. It was during the service. The Russian law enforcement officers entered the building, took the churchgoers outdoors, and started interrogating them about this allegedly legal service, referring to the Yarovaya law that disallows services being conducted in churches. So, thus, another Ukrainian Orthodox church community was closed down in this village. A land plot has been allocated to build another cathedral in Sevastopol, but it was occupied by the local authorities and transferred to construction companies to start building residential buildings, even though they wanted to document that the land plot was transferred to build residential buildings for the officers of FSB. Just you imagine. So we have lost this land plot already, and that's where the construction works are being carried out. What's the fate of Metropolite? Well, thanks God, Metropolite Clement is safe, like the priests who, after the full-fledged invasion, received mobilization recruitment orders, and there was threat that they will be mobilized to the Russian armed forces, which was done intentionally because some of the priests have been taken to safety, so they're no longer at the territory of Crimea. Along with Metropolite, you can see him in Mikhailivsky Cathedral at the church service together with Metropolite Epiphany. Thank you, Andriy. Colleagues, if you have any comments or questions, by raise of hand.
Monesi for the Italian daily Corriere della Sera from Milano, Italy. Sir, could you help us to give a proportion, a dimension to this phenomenon? We know that population of Crimea have been deported, have been expelled, many people escape. When you talk about Muslim community, Ukrainian Orthodox Church communities, how many people were, how many people are today, how many are left there? Because, you know, and Muslim too, Tatar. It happened to me to meet some of the Tatar exponent member of the Muslim Tatar community in Odessa, who are recreating a kind of community. Can you give us at least 2 or 3 groups, an idea what happened to them? How many were there? How many are left? How many have been in jail or persecuted? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Actually, before occupation of Crimea in 2014, we have 2.3 million people in Crimea totally. After all these persecutions, after occupation of territory of Crimea, many people had to flee, of course. But we don't have exact number of people who are left Crimea after occupation, because not all people are registered as IDPs, internal displaced persons. Before full-scale invasion, officially we have 53,000 people who are registered as an IDP. But we understand that a number of these persons who fled Crimea, it's more than even 100,000 people. But after full-scale invasion, of course, a wave of this fleeing Crimea, it's grown up, unfortunately, because of persecution, because of mobilization campaign against Crimeans. Because Russia violate international humanitarian law, and they conscript and mobilized civil population in Crimea. That is why Crimean Tatars and political Ukrainians had to flee Crimea because of mobilization processes which started in autumn 2022. When we say about demographic composition of Crimea after occupation of Crimea in 2014 or full-scale invasion, Russia start immediately after occupation of Crimea start this colonization process or newly colonization of processes to changing demographic composition of Crimea. That is why at one hand they pushed our people from Crimea, from another hand they transferred illegally, of course, Russian population from Russian Federation. And when we say about Russian, we don't say about ethnical, we say about citizenship. They transferred Russian citizens to Crimea. And it's approximately 800,000 people who legally came and stay in Crimea. Of course, Russia used different stimulation program for this transferring of Russian population. If we say about ethnical background, it's near 15% of people are Crimean Tatar ethnical minority. It's indigenous population of Crimea and Ukraine, and it's a Muslim population. Не 30, да, десь офіційно було? 49. Українців. 49 українців. Ні, я не про парафію. Near 24% of people are Ukrainians in Crimea. And another, it's Russians or another ethnical minorities in Crimea. But why we have this such demographic composition? Because Russia start to erase identity from 18th centuries. We don't say about historical revisionism, but it's very important to say it, because before first annexation of Crimea by Catherine II, we have 95% of people in Crimea, and they are Crimean Tatars. After 1944, with deportation of Crimean Tatar people, we have 0 Crimean Tatars. And when we say about these persecutions in Crimea after occupation, yes, mostly it's against Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. When I say data about political prisoners, 208 political prisoners, Crimean political prisoners we have, and 126 of them are Crimean Tatars. When we say about mobilization processes, we say about mobilization against Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. When we say about these parishes, when we say about persecutions of Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar religious group, it's also about persecutions on the basis of ethnical and religious ground.
У нас є ще питання.
Доброго дня, Михайло Потоцький. Хотів уточнити.
Mikhail Potocki from Poland. So you stated that there were 10 mosques that were not under this spiritual leaders. Is there similar statistic about the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? How many of those churches are left that are still not under the control of the Russian Moscow Patriarchate? Well, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was not under the jurisdiction of the occupying authorities, not for a single day. Yeah, there was time of survival and opposition, and there is not a single Ukrainian Orthodox Church community in Crimea under the Russian occupying authorities. No, but like I said, we're not functioning. As of May the 11th, 2022, our churches stopped performing their services in Crimea. Well, I would like to thank our keynote speakers. Thank you for this extremely important job that you're doing. Thank you, colleagues, for being interested in this important topic, and thank you, the Armed Forces of Ukraine.